Good afternoon, and welcome to our session on self-care for caregivers. I'm Diane Harkins. I'm with WestEd's CIBC Network, the California Inclusion and Behavior Consultation Network, and I'm going to be talking to you today about self-care for us, for caregivers. This event, the Inclusion Collaborative Conference, is coming at a time when we're all faced with some unusual external stressors in our lives, regardless of the kind of work that we're doing right now with children and families. And those stressors are challenging our capacity to take care of ourselves and take care of others. If you had asked me in 2019, would I do a workshop online about self-care? I'd be like, no way. We need to be together. People need to be discussing. There needs to be exchange of ideas. There's something that the energy that happens in a room full of adult learners that's really unique. But here we are. This is what we have right now. And you can probably think of lots of ways that you've had to modify your life at this time. I thought of it the other day as like I'm used to dancing salsa and merengue, and suddenly you want me to waltz. And my body and my brain, they don't know how to waltz. So we all may be feeling some kind of loss of competence as professionals right now. And that's okay. That's part of the landscape. That's part of the norm right now. You may be someone who's thought a lot about self-care, or this may be somewhat new to you. Either way, think of today, this next hour, as a buffet. I'm going to offer out some ideas. They may be things you do already. They may be things that are new to you. And from that buffet, especially because we can't go to restaurants now and have a nice big buffet, you get to make some choices about what you want to add to your self-care regimen. To think about in this next hour what's working for you right now during the pandemic, during the fires, during the economic instability, the elections, all these things that we're dealing with, what's working for you and what's not working for you in terms of self-care. So take a breath and let's spend the next hour looking at some ideas about this. Next slide, please. So we're going to go over 3 topics. One is about promoting resilience, which we usually think of resilience in our field as pertaining to children, but it pertains to adults as well. So we're going to talk about resilience for ourselves. We're going to dive a little bit into the body's stress response system to see what's happening when we experience stress. And then we'll talk about that buffet I suggested, the menu, the ideas around practices of self-care. Next slide, please. So my hope at the end of this hour is that you'll be able to define resilience, say what it is, briefly explain to somebody how the human body responds to stress, recognize symptoms of stress in adults, and identify some self-care practices that you want to put in place. Next slide, please. Let me give you a little context for my work that I do. The CIBC network is statewide, and we offer technical assistance to administrators, teachers, and family child care providers in early learning and care settings. The focus of our work is to improve the capacity of early learning and care staff to provide effective early learning inclusive environments for children with developmental delays, disabilities, and/or challenging behaviors. And so if you are interested in learning more about our work and our consultation, you can go to our website at cibc-ca.org and learn a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. I'm going to read this quote to you if you don't mind. So it says, according to neuroscientists, we're only conscious of 5% of our cognitive activity. So most of our decisions, actions, emotions, and behaviors depend on 95% of our brain activity that goes beyond our conscious awareness. I want to highlight that part about that it goes beyond our conscious awareness. Next slide, please. So, part of what we'll talk about in this hour is about our self-awareness and increasing our awareness. So, think for a moment, do a little check-in with yourself. And what's one word that describes how you're feeling right now? Just one word. It's likely that we don't do that a lot, check in with ourselves. And yet, doing so, instead of making us feel worse, like, oh no, I'm kind of anxious right now, or I'm feeling a little angry about that, it actually helps us in general to become aware of what we're feeling. But here, and this picture of the iceberg is a good example of this, is that the majority of our conscious awareness, like the majority of an iceberg, is below the surface of the water. Most of the iceberg, what we're seeing here in this picture, and I've never seen a real iceberg, most of it is under the water. And so we can think about that in terms of our own cognitive activity, our own self-awareness, is that most of the time we're not consciously aware of it. Next slide, please. So, what's resilience? Here's the thing, is that resilience is what we do in the face of adversity. Some people use the word adapt. Some people are using the word pivot. I gave you the metaphor of dancing salsa and then going to waltzing, but it's this process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. And we draw on, if you could just go back, thanks, go back 1 minute, there you go. What we draw on some internal resources as well as external resources when we're feeling stressed. And those resources help promote our resilience. So some of the internal resources that we draw upon are the same ones that we're attempting to instill in children, to promote in young children. They're key features of social emotional development. They include self-regulation, problem solving, self-efficacy, that sense of, yes, I can do something, I can make a difference. These are all the things that we're drawing upon when we're faced with adversity. Next slide. And then you can see that I'm kind of into metaphors. So although we don't use yo-yos very much anymore, resilience is like a yo-yo, because it's that ability to survive stress or bounce back. And the thing is to remember is we will go through the stress. It doesn't mean we don't have any stress, right? Stress is part of life, but it means that we'll be able to bounce back from it. So whether we're dealing with physical distancing issues from our families, economic instability, healthcare concerns, we need to consider how we promote resilience in ourselves when faced with these stressors. Next slide, please. And here's something that I know is not a secret, especially to people working with young children, is that resilience rests fundamentally on our relationships. And that's part of what makes now so challenging for people because of the need to physically distance. But over and over, researchers have found that that responsive relationships with caring adults promote resilience in children. You may be aware of the Kauai study that started in the 1950s, before many of us were born, but it was a study done by Dr. Emmy Werner from UC Davis. And she studied all the children born that year and followed them, she and her colleagues, into their 60s. And although a high percentage of the children in this study had risk factors, perhaps premature birth, maternal depression, poverty, they found that about 1/3 of the children showed no signs of behavioral or learning problems as they grew up into competent, well-adjusted adults. So Dr. Werner and her colleagues said, what's different about these kids? What's different about them? And they found that these children had at least one positive relationship with a non-familial adult. And I think that means so much for the work that we do, because most of the children that we're serving are not our own children. They're somebody else's children. But knowing that we can have this positive influence, lifelong influence on them, is significant. So, but COVID-19, as I said, has really had a profound effect on our relationship. Some of us feel isolated. And in other cases, some of us may feel we can't get a break from our family because we're all piled in together. Regardless of how we're feeling, though, relationships matter for adults. Next slide, please. So here's a photo of myself and a friend who's in my bubble, Mary Louise, wearing our masks. And the thing is that we know that emotions are contagious, that we absorb some of what other people are feeling, their pain, their distress, their happiness. Even while wearing masks, that still happens. And so this is something we need to think about in terms of how we take care of ourselves and minimize the risk of compassion fatigue and the stress that comes from serving and being a helper to others. Next slide. So what's going on in our body when we're experiencing this stress? And I want to show this to you because I think it helps normalize some of what people are going through. Some people talk like, oh, it's like a roller coaster. One day I'm okay, the next day I just feel like everything's awful. And I want to normalize that because this is something that's built into our neurobiology. This is part of who we are and what has helped us survive as a species over time. So let's look at it a little more closely because I think when we understand it, we may have a little more compassion for ourselves and for others. Next slide. So here's the thing is that I hope you take away from today's session is that stress is adaptive. It helps us learn actually to self-regulate. When you play peekaboo with the baby has this one moment where they're not seeing your face and they're tolerating that not knowing. That is one of the ways that they actually learn to self-regulate is tolerating those uncomfortable and not knowing moments. So stress is adaptive, but it's also on a continuum. And I think this is a good way to look at it, is that let's look at these three. There's positive, tolerable, and toxic stress. So positive stress is like the baby playing peekaboo, right? Or the baby in childcare who the caregiver can't get to him immediately because she's changing another baby's diaper. And so she calls out, Marco, I'll be with you in a minute. And so over time, we don't want Marco lying there crying for hours, but over time, little bits of that discomfort or distress actually helps him learn to manage the stress. So for children, the first day of school is actually a form of positive stress. It might be taking your driver's exam is a positive stress, or going for a job interview. These are all things that we can tolerate there, and we bounce back from them fairly quickly. We may feel scared, upset, irritated in the moment, but we bounce back. Tolerable stress occurs in the face of something more serious. So for a child, it may be a major surgery, or us experiencing an earthquake or evacuation. What makes those experiences tolerable are a couple things. One is that there's a beginning and an end. And I think that's what makes now harder for many of us, because it doesn't feel like there's an end. But the other thing that makes it tolerable, especially for children, is the presence of a responsive, caring adult. And this is usually a caregiver or a family member. Having that person available to them helps them bounce back and become more resilient, even in the face of something major. And then lastly, toxic stress has to do with more ongoing stressful situations, ongoing poverty, ongoing racial discrimination, ongoing economic instability, or ongoing health issues. Those things, especially without the presence of a caring adult, can be considered toxic, and actually can have a lifelong effect on us. And I'm sure you're familiar with the ACEs studies that were done by Kaiser and have now been replicated, showing that a lot of adults who have major health issues later on had some significant early stressors. So I think the takeaway from this is that we want to, as much as possible for ourselves and for children, is to try to keep things in the tolerable category when we can, and maybe even in the positive category. And how we behave is really what makes the difference for one another. Next slide, please. So I know you didn't sign up for a neurobiology class, but this is the part that I think where we can have a little more compassion for ourselves when we understand a little bit about what's happening inside our bodies. So there's this thing we call the HPA axis, hypothalamic adrenal axis. And this is our stress messaging system. This is something that's built into, you can see in this slide, our brain and our body, where we receive up in the brain, there's a little piece in the limbic system called the amygdala that perceives stress or threat, that says, for example, I'm walking down the street, I see this big dog about 20 yards ahead of me, and my amygdala goes off and says, you better pay attention to this. It sends a message to my hypothalamus, which is still in my brain, to release a particular hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone. And the release of that hormone sets off another chain reaction where it sends a message to the pituitary gland. And you can see that in this slide. They're not that big. They look like kidney beans there, and they're not so big, but it sends them, oh no, sorry, the pituitary gland, I apologize, is still up in the brain, closer to our brain stem actually. And it sends a message to the pituitary gland to release hormones. And then the pituitary gland releases ACTH, which tells the adrenal gland, and that's the part down relatively in our bellies, that says, there's something going on here. We're going to release cortisol so you can be alert and you can do what you need to do in the moment. Like if you need to run, if you need to think quickly about how do I handle this situation, that's what all of that does. It doesn't necessarily make us more scared. think about it as it makes us more alert and vigilant. And so you can imagine for a child or an adult who's constantly under stress, that stays elevated. They become more hyper vigilant. The idea in general is for us to go back to a resting state where we're not perceiving threat necessarily and we're not releasing these hormones constantly. So, for example, with the dog on the street, I may see, oh, yeah, that's Carolina's dog. He's okay. He has a loud bark, but he knows me, so he's not going to bother me, right? Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Now that we know a little bit more about how this sends a message through our body and helps us respond when we feel threatened, why is it that some people would react to the big dog and some people won't? Right? Because we all react differently. And we may be looking at that right now, that some people don't seem to be as bothered by the news. Other people have a hard time watching the news. What's different about us as human beings? So, some of the things that impact our stress response include our temperament. I have a friend who's an introvert. She's actually really enjoyed shelter in place because she doesn't like to spend a lot of time with other people anyway. She's fine with some phone calls, texting, a little Zoom, but she doesn't have to have a lot of face to face contact with others. Other people are extroverted and really, really miss the personal contact. Another thing that impacts our stress response is our cognitive development. So, can we correctly appraise the situation? And you can think about folks that you work with who may have some cognitive delays or deficits and may not be able to read the situation correctly. That dog down the street, they may not be able to appraise that situation or understand some of the contextual cues. And the younger we are, the less able we are to understand the context of what's going on. The other thing that impacts our response is how much control we have. So, the more control we have over a situation, reactivity is usually lower. The other thing is obviously social support, who we have in our circle. And then what I think of as some of our pre-existing psychological factors, because we have them. Just as we may have some pre-existing physical conditions or medical conditions, some of us have pre-existing mental health conditions. So if we're someone who leans toward depression, that may be heightened now. If we're someone who has an anxiety disorder, that may be more impacting us more now. So those psychological issues also kind of impact our stress response. And I share this with you because I think what's stressful for one person may not be stressful for another. And so part of what we're doing is checking in with ourselves to see, is this affecting me or not? And be okay if it's affecting me and maybe not my spouse, or maybe not my child, or maybe not my best friend, that this may be something I'm uniquely feeling right now, and that's okay. Next slide, please. So these are some key points. Maybe they don't need to be said, but I'm going to share them anyway. One is obviously our stress can impact our reactions to people and situations. We may be more irritable when we're feeling stressed. We may have a harder time making decisions when we're feeling stressed. And we may read people wrong. It may be that somebody was well-intentioned, but we took what they said the wrong way because of our stress. But here's the thing, is that when that stress accumulates without the balance of restorative activities, it can lead to long-term adverse health outcomes. So we have the opportunity to seek out balance even when we're going through this ongoing stress. Next slide. So I'm going to talk now about some of the symptoms of stress, and you're probably already thinking about yourself or someone in your life um, that you may be concerned about. But what does it tend to look like? Next slide, please. And there are various lists that you can find. This particular one is from Dr. Bruce Perry's neurosequential. Um, he has great um, PowerPoints on COVID-19 stress and distress, and I encourage you to look at those. He goes deep into the neurobiology, but it's really, really well done. So let's just take as an example the individual indicators of distress that he's laid out. And I think a good way to look at it is just these three categories: emotional, physical, and personal. So and we may be feeling all three, but let's go through them. So some of us may experience more anger, more sadness. There are more of us, I think, experiencing grief right now, the loss of things that we used to have in our lives that we may not have now. And then anxiety and depression, whether or not we've had it in the past, it may be something that comes up now that we're under prolonged distress. Physically, and this is where I find people feel more comfortable talking about their physical ailments. We may say, "Oh, I've got more headaches," or "My stomach's bothering me." Um, I'm tired all the time. Even constipation is sometimes a sign of being more distressed. And as I said, I think people are a little more comfortable talking about those symptoms than maybe talking about how they're feeling emotionally. And on the personal level, some of the things that we see when people are under prolonged distress is they might tend to self isolate more. So, someone who is usually more linked to people may pull back more. We also may see people becoming more cynical. Why should I care? This just isn't over, it's not ending. So, there may be more cynicism. And as I mentioned earlier, more irritability, where we take things the wrong way. We've just got a shorter fuse. So if you think about it, think about yourself. Where do your signs of distress tend to show up? In all three of these places, in one or two of them. But even being able to name that is, again, increasing your self-awareness about how you're reacting. Okay, next slide, please. So whether or not you're experiencing any of the signs of distress that we just talked about, it is still a good practice to incorporate self-care into our lives and do it intentionally, because there's so many things we can do unintentionally. And these are things that I fall into. You may fall into them as well, where I find myself glued in front of the television more, or stress eating more, not getting up and out and about and walking. So there's some habits we can fall into, fallback positions that may not be helpful to us. And that's why it's really important to balance that out with positive self-care strategies. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to say something now and think about your response to it. Self-care is not selfish. Self-care is not selfish. How does that sit with you? Some of us have been raised to believe that we must always do for others, not for ourselves, that taking care of ourselves is selfish. If that's been part of your history, part of your belief system about the world, it may be something you want to look at a little bit more. Is it helping you now? Or is the idea that self-care is a way to help myself and others, is that more of an attitude that may help me now if I'm under prolonged stress? So self-care actually, and the research backs this up, increases our energy, it reduces our stress, and it helps us feel more present, more alive where we are. Next slide, please. The National Child Trauma Stress Network has a thing on the next slide called the ABCs. And they describe this as, when you're thinking about self-care, as awareness, balance, and connection. And I actually like this as a good little check-in with myself about where I'm at with each. So you remember at the beginning, I asked you to think about a word that describes how you're feeling. That's awareness. When I asked you to think about how stress shows up in your body and mind, that's awareness. So the awareness is the first step in taking care of ourselves. The second step is balance. It's that idea about finding both internal and external things between our work, our home, our numerous responsibilities, of being able to balance these things. We all have times in our life when it feels really out of balance. And in general, what we attempt to do is to try to bring things back into balance. The last is connection. We're going to talk about some ways that people have found to stay connected even during COVID-19. And you've seen things like obviously using Zoom, and there's all kinds of apps now that you can use. Somebody told me about Marco Polo. Earlier during the pandemic or shelter in place, people were putting teddy bears in their windows so that children took a walk in the neighborhood, try to find the teddy bears in the windows. That's a form of connection too. When I earlier in the pandemic, and this makes me think we need to do some of these things again, I saw that people would write inspirational quotes in chalk on the sidewalk. So when I was out walking my dog, I'd just stop and read this quote that gave me hope. So there's lots of ways that people are finding to stay connected even while they're physically distant. Next slide, please. Again, I'm going to read this quote to you. See how it fits with your experience. Sometimes we don't realize how stressed we are. When we're caught up in day-to-day activities, it's easy to gloss over possible stressors. At the end of each day, simply noting our stress level can make us more aware of our feelings and actually lead to reduced anxiety. So some of the ways to do that are just to name it, to say it to yourself, maybe while you're brushing your teeth before you go to bed, maybe when your head hits the pillow, to do it whenever it works for you. Some people do a 1 to 10 scale in terms of, oh, my stress today, it was kind of at a 2, then it went to a 5. Okay, that gives me some information about how I'm responding to what's happening in the world. Some people use that thermometer that we use with children sometimes in social emotional learning. Am I in the green zone, the yellow zone, or the red zone? What's my day been like? And again, just finding these ways to check in with ourselves actually have been found to help reduce our anxiety. Next slide, please. There's another awareness activity that is used in the recovery field, and it's actually used in some intervention programs as well with children. It's called Halt, and it stands for hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. So when we get caught up in day-to-day things and all these things are coming at us and we're not feeling right, here's a good first step, is to ask myself, okay, am I hungry right now? Am I angry? Some people say hangry when they're hungry and angry. Am I feeling lonely? Like, oh, I'm all alone in this? Or am I tired? And the thing is, if it's one of those four things, and it may not be, but if it's one of those four things, then make a plan for dealing with it. So if I'm hungry, okay, I'm on this Zoom session right now. I want to stay with it. I haven't had lunch yet. So I know at 1:15 I'm going to head to the kitchen or pull out my banana or whatever it is and take care of myself. So just being able to put a plan in place, even if it's something you can't do immediately, can actually help. Okay, next slide, please. The other thing that influences our level of stress is this idea of mental real estate, of what's taking up all the room. The average person generates about 70,000 thoughts per day. I mean, that's incredible, right? Now, I'm not asking you to try and think of all those thoughts or pay attention to all those thoughts. Many of them just pass right through, but to pay attention to any patterns in your thoughts. And here's the thing, that our brains, and you think back to that amygdala and recognizing a threat or something we need to pay attention to, our brain is designed to become aware of threat and protect ourselves. So as human beings, many of us have this tendency toward a negative bias. We're looking for that thing that might threaten me, and I've got to protect myself. Whether it's my coworker saying something judgmental, if it's a child I'm working with who's having a bad day and lashes out at me, whatever it may be, we tend to seek out those things, pay attention to what's wrong more than we pay attention to what's right and what's going well. And indeed, our medical model was set up in that way. It's let me find out what's wrong with you, and then we'll treat it. More and more in our professional lives, we're moving to this idea of let me learn what strengths you have and let's build upon those. Let's start with what you have in place. So there's this shift that we're doing that may be not in line with how our brains have been developing over hundreds and thousands of years, right? So becoming aware of that, if we do have that tendency towards a negative bias or negative thoughts, becoming aware of that can actually help us begin to cut ourselves a break and start thinking more positive thoughts, particularly during difficult times. Next slide, please. So think for a moment about the positive messages that you send yourself that just come up in your mind. So it might be thoughts like, I can deal with this, I've got this, or I am so grateful for my sister right now. She just really helps me during this time. Those are all positive thoughts. Now think of the negative messages that may tend to surface for you. I'm not exercising. I'm not doing enough to take care of myself. I don't feel like I'm good at my job. Think of those negative messages that you tend to send yourself. Next slide, please. And here's the thing is that even if it's something just going on in our own head and we're not saying it out loud, that negative self-talk influences how we're feeling and how we deal with other people. So for that reason alone, beginning to become aware of that negative self-talk and implementing some positive self-talk is really important, both personally and professionally. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit more about some strategies that we can use that have been found. Some of these are research-based, have been found to really be helpful for people in the short term and in terms of long-term health. And one of them is mindful self-compassion. Research on the positive effects of mindful self-compassion is amazing. Over 1,000 studies have demonstrated the mental and physical health benefits of practicing mindful self-compassion. And I'm just going to name some of these statements here that are examples of mindful self-compassion and just see how they sit with you. Are there any of these that resonate with you more? May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I be kind to myself. May I experience love and joy. May I accept myself just as I am. May I feel peace. Did any of those work for you? Are they things that you can replace when you feel some of the negative self-talk coming up? Can you replace it with one of these statements? Because the good news is that self-compassion can be learned. Kristen Neff is one of the leading researchers in this area, and she says that the quintessential self-compassion question is, what do I need? And remember when we talked about Halt? That's one of those places where you can say, okay, I'm feeling X right now. What do I need? And notice that the statements on this slide are I, but not the kind of I statements where we say, I need you to stop bugging me. That's not the kind of I statement we're talking about. We're talking about what we can experience for ourselves, what we have control over. Next slide, please. The other thing, and if you look into some of Bruce Perry's work that they're talking about more now, is what can we do to self-regulate in the moment? So for those of us who, I know not a lot of us are doing home visits right now, but let's say you're doing a lot of Zoom sessions, or let's say you're in a program with children for a good part of the day. We may move into a super high anxiety state sometimes. It happens to all of us. And the goal is, when we're aware of that, is to help ourselves transition into a more calm cognitive state. So a state where we can think more clearly about what we want to do. Even that question, what do I need, is an example of moving into that calm cognitive state. But there's physically things that we can do to make that move when we're feeling this way. And for those of us working directly with children, it's actually kind of cool because some of the things we do with children can really help us too. So dancing, walking, running, singing, although I know right now we're encouraging people not to sing because of the spread of COVID-19, but also meditative breathing. And we'll look at some breathing techniques in a few minutes. But these are things that can help us move from that high anxiety state to more of a calm state. It's something that many of us do with children, and we need to practice it for ourselves as well. One example of a breathing technique is called box breathing. And that's where you breathe in through your nose, counting to 4, and then you exhale through pursed lips to the count of 4, and you do it 4 times. So even if we're in a situation like right in between Zoom calls or right in between visits with families, we can take a few moments to do box breathing. Next slide, please. So have you heard of the term attention economy? What people are saying now is that we live in an attention economy. It means that we live in a world that is designed to distract us. Twitter, texting, TV, all the T's. Social media has been an incredible advance, obviously. We're able to connect right now through social media, but it also can contribute to being highly distractive. So some of the practices that are suggested help us to become more focused, more balanced, and mindfulness-based stress reduction includes breathing. For some people, they like to do more movement, stretching, yoga. There's things people do sitting down, standing up, things that we do with our hands. If you're interested in some of those techniques that you can use both in the moment, but also when you're attempting to bring some balance into your life and create some self-care routines, there's lots of information. There'll be a slide at the end that names some of them. But I think one of the key messages of all these techniques and practices is this idea of being gentle with ourselves. Next slide. So here's a little bit more neurobiology. Helping others activates the part of our brain that releases a hormone that feels pleasure. It releases oxytocin. We call it the feel-good hormone. So acts of kindness, doing something for someone else, whether you know them or not, can increase your oxytocin level. And there's this one example that I read about that I thought was so cool. So there was a drive-through coffee place in Winnipeg, Canada. And you know how sometimes somebody will pay for the person in the vehicle behind them? Well, that happened. And it continued without a break for 226 customers came through and paid for the person behind them. And they didn't talk with each other about this. They just did it. Now, can you imagine if you're watching the news that night and you hear about this, that you were one of those 226 people that formed this chain of kindness? I mean, it's absolutely wonderful. So let's set a goal to be kinder to others and see how it feels. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier that statement, I'm so grateful for my sister. We know that, again, this is research-based, that feelings of thankfulness can actually improve our sleep, diminish our tiredness and fatigue, increase our confidence, and actually lessen depression. Some people keep gratitude journals. There's also apps available now that have to do with gratitude, but making this part of a regular practice can actually have some health benefits. Next slide, please. But as I mentioned earlier, the most powerful buffer in times of stress and distress is our social connectedness. And Bruce Perry has talked about, and probably others too, about how do you remain physically distant but emotionally close. Next slide, please. So you may want to finish this sentence for yourself. If we were together, we would talk about this because we could get some good ideas from one another. But what's one way that you stay physically distant but emotionally close to other people in your life? And whatever it is, give yourself a little pat on the back for that because you're doing it. You're finding ways in this incredibly unprecedented time to stay emotionally close to others. Next slide, please. I think the bottom line here, this picture is of my goddaughter's daughter. They live in Jordan, so we only get to Zoom. We don't get to see one another. But what I know people need more than anything is to be understood and to be seen. And so that's a question we can ask ourselves. And we can imagine that other people are asking it of us. Do you get me? I imagine Simone here in this photo saying, do you get me, Diane? And how do I show her that I get her? So think about in your own life, who gets you? Next slide, please. Okay, so it's time to think about what you might want to add to your toolkit, your self-care toolkit. If you only had 1 minute, what could you do to take care of yourself? 1 minute. What would you do? It may be something we've discussed in this last hour. It may be something you're already doing or something you heard from a friend. And then what would you do if you had 15 minutes to yourself? What's a self-care activity that you might use to help you? Next slide, please. And then beyond what happens in the moment, what can I do on a daily basis? What can I put in place that maybe I don't have in place right now? And I know it would be helpful to me. And then what can I do where I have something to look forward to on a weekly or a monthly basis? Is there some type of self-care that I can do that I can look forward to each week or each month? What can I put in place? Next slide, please. So here's the message I want to leave you with is you are resilient. I think of people in the helping professions right now as being like lighthouses. We're protecting people, we're keeping them safe, whether mentally, physically, however we're doing it. And we're shining a light in the darkness. We're bringing hope to others that things can be different. And so my wish for you is that you be resilient like a lighthouse, that you withstand the stormy, dark weather that we find ourselves in. And my hope is that the tools that we've reviewed today are ones that you can pick up and use in your own life. Next slide, please. And here are some resources based on some of the things that I discussed that you might want to look into. You may know of others that you want to share in the chat box with people. And on behalf of CIBC, I just want to say thank you for participating in this conference, and be safe and stay well. Thank you, everybody.